Let me start off with where we're going to end for this first part of the session today. We're going to end up looking at a report that looks something like this, which is 116 different processes on it. They all have control limits. They all have spec limits. They all have alarm rates and everything like that. And we have the ability to go in and do some high-level screening and things like that as well. This is a tool that we have called process screening in JMP. And in order to talk about how we deal with control charting in general and how we deal with this idea of working with process data, the first thing we need to understand is that the more you tell JMP about your data table, the less work you have to do. And so what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to be leveraging a column property in JMP that holds the spec limits. There's a suite of column properties in JMP. If we go to column info, under column properties, there's a whole collection of them here: spec limits, control limits, all kinds of things like that, that are specifically related to process screening capabilities. So these are the ones we're going to work with. We're going to work specifically with this first spec limit one. That's kind of the foundational one we need. And if you want to do it manually, all you have to do is turn on the spec limits and then enter in your numbers. Something that's not turned on here that I really like having turned on is the show graph as reference lines. That's incredibly important in my mind. Every time you plot this data, we want to know what those spec limits are, and we want to know where the data is relative to those spec limits. So I always make it a habit of, when I'm doing this manually, I turn these on. This data set is a semiconductor data set. It's got a lot of value. It's got well, not a lot, about 1,400 records, about 117 process variables. It could be any process control data set, but it just has specs. So that's all we need to worry about. Now that I've told JMP about what my spec limits are for this, I can go into Control Chart Builder. And why do I talk about going into Control Chart Builder when I'm going to end up in process screening? Well, because all of these tools are interrelated. And I want to show you Control Chart Builder first, and then I'm going to show you how to get from process screening to Control Chart Builder really quickly. Okay, so this is kind of building on that whole foundation. We're going to go to Analyze, Quality and Process, Control Chart Builder. And we're just going to take my first process here, and I'm going to drag it over to X. Now, for those of you that may be familiar with doing control charting, you may have just said, hey, this thing picked an IMR chart, an individual moving range chart. And the thing that when we're doing process work, we're doing control charting work, is we 9 times out of 10 will have this just really obnoxious flow chart that we have to kind of draw on the wall and figure out what kind of a control chart we're doing. The general rule of thumb is if you can draw something like that, there's no reason a programmer shouldn't be able to automate it. With enough information, the programmer should be able to automate that process of selecting a control chart. That's what Control Chart Builder does. So in this case, I've told it that I've got data, and if I have data without a grouping variable, that's an IMR chart. Okay, I'm going to give it a grouping variable. I'm going to group it by wafer ID. And now I've got an X bar and R chart. What did I just do? Well, I just went and I averaged all of my values within a particular subgroup. In this case, it's called a wafer ID. So we've got multiple measurements per part, if we want to call it that. And what we've done here is now we're plotting the means. We're plotting the range on this chart. And notice that the LSL and the USL are quite far away from this mean value, but the target, they're fairly close to the target. Now, we can make some changes here. This is very close to Graph Builder in terms of what we can do. So there is a drop zone area. And then over here, there are a number of specs, or a number of preferences that we can control for each element in the control chart itself. Before we go into doing any tinkering, though, let me show you one thing about this. If I move over here, because I gave JMP the spec limits, when I created my control chart, it automatically took me into a process capability analysis. So I have the ability to look at my CPKs, my PPKs. I have my non-conformance values here. Under my red triangle, I have the ability to control the histogram capabilities. And if I go up one level on the red triangle, I even have the ability to bring in things like my interactive capability plot that let me play what if games with my different parameters when I'm working on this CPK analysis. So all of that you get for free, incredibly powerful and incredibly useful. I really like pulling up the interactive capability plot when I would be talking with people about how do we change things, what's the best way to go after a particular change in a situation. It's a good way to do that what if game in a working meeting and say, okay, well, if we focus on bringing the spec limits in, what do we expect that to do to our CPK, PPK numbers? If we are able to shift a target, what does that do? And gives us that real-time feedback to help us understand what's going on. But it's right there under the red triangle. And all you have to do to get it is give the data table column, your process column, a spec limit, and you get it for free. It even shows up in distribution as well. Let's go over really quick and just highlight a couple of things that we can do with our control chart builder before we go on. So if we wanted to go from an X bar R to say an X bar S, we want to look at the standard deviation. We come down to here where it says range and we change that to standard deviation. And we change our limits. Oh, it changed my limits for me. Look at that. And we can do the same up here. The limits, we'll change those to based on the standard deviation. And we'll leave that as the average as well. And you can see now at the top, it's changed it from an X bar R to an X bar S chart. Okay, again, all we're doing is we're telling JMP a little bit about what we need to know so we can work with that. Now, what about if we wanted to make some adjustments or if we want to turn on some tests? In some ways, we can come to the red triangle and turn on a few things like we can turn on we can come in and turn on alarms and things like that. But in general, the best way that we want to do this is by right-clicking on the graph. This is one of the weird places where the red triangle doesn't give us the kind of things that we would want to see under the red triangle. This is one of those places where the right-click does more of the work for us. So in this case, we can come to our points, we can turn on box plots, and we can turn on individual statistics to see the data points. You can see we've got probably an outlier right here or something like that. We've got some data that's kind of weird. I'll turn those individual points off just because they're cluttering things up. We can also come in here and turn on my warnings. This is where we would turn on our short rules. We can turn on our Westgard rules. We can turn on our other sets of rules as well. We can test beyond limits, or we can do custom tests. Okay, I'll turn on a couple of these just to make it interesting. In this case, in this particular data set, we don't have anything to write home about. We'll see that come into play a little bit later in one of the other examples. The other things that we can do, we can shade our sigma zones. This is something that people love to see. Generally have to turn on the zones too to see them. Sigma. All right, it's misbehaving on me. Normally we can just right click on that and turn those on. But we can turn on a red, green, and yellows, or red, yellow, and green zone shading for this as well. So that's something we can work with. We'll talk about a few other things that we can do as well in a minute, but if we wanted to turn on, oh, there it goes. If we wanted to turn on a three-way control chart where we look at our standard deviation and moving range as well, we can get all of that information. Awesome. All right. So that's kind of an introduction into the control charts. Another thing, if we come in and go short variables, we have control over some of those more advanced capabilities. And we also have the ability to turn on some other types of charts, like median moving range, or if you're in that realm, you can turn on the Levy-Jennings charts as well. But there's some controversy around that, so we won't go too deep there today. If we took a control chart like this, which is just a basic X bar R chart, right? This is more or less where we were before. It looks a little different because I've turned off the control panel here. So there we are. That's where we were before. But when we want to hide these controls, we can say done. When you come to the red triangle, you can turn on something called a local data filter. And if you've got a date stamp within your data set, so for instance, you're collecting data by day or something like that, you can come in and use that as a date stamp. So we can actually can see me filter in by wafer ID in here and things like that. And you can see, if you watch carefully, you can see the histograms and the CPKs changing as it goes along as well. So we've been able to play with one data set. And if I were to go into the process screening platform to be able to and look at just this one data set, I could get summaries of all that information that I want. Let's go and look at that just to see what it looks like.